I think it has, thank you. I think it has wider significance. So even I will talk about some European details that may or may not interest you. I think that for any country that is interested in developing its sustainability reporting, like Indonesia, the European story has some lessons to learn, I guess, and it's part of the wider movement worldwide towards improved sustainability reporting. So here we go. The main things I want to talk about this afternoon, it is a little bit about politics and it's a little bit about reporting, a bit of both. And the main story is that, in outline, that Europe had very high ambitions for a major change to corporate and really take a very big step towards improved sustainability reporting. And over the last few years, it has been an incredible story of very fast development of regulation. But about the same time that this regulation came into force, we have seen a change of political climate and a kind of movement against or towards reduced sustainability reporting requirements. So we had a strange situation that in the first year when these requirements came into force, people already started to think about how you could or should reduce them. And we'll talk about that a bit more later on, obviously, but now we are in a situation that we are going to move ahead with sustainability reporting, but with reduced scale and scope. That's the outline of the story I'm going to tell, and I will take you through some of the details as we go along. And by the way, if you do have any questions or comments to make, we are not a huge group, so I suggest feel free to do that. Maybe Alfia, we can keep an eye on the chat if there are any questions there, but I wouldn't mind either if you just switch on your microphone and ask your questions as we go along. But otherwise, there will also be an opportunity for questions and discussion at the end, I think. Is my voice quality okay? Can you hear what I'm saying? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. So if something wrong with the voice or the sound quality or whatever, just let me know. Okay, here we go. First of all, very quickly, but you probably know that already about the European Union that we are talking about, a block of countries, 27 countries plus 3 associated countries, quite a large economy, quite a large block in terms of population. So it's a serious issue if this block tries to do something in terms of sustainability, in terms of reporting. Yeah, that involves a lot of people and a lot of companies. And a crucial thing about the European Union that you should keep in mind, and you may or may not know it already, but it is somewhere in between a superstate and a simple cooperative agreement. So the member states, the 27 member states, are still individual member states. They have their own parliaments and their own governments and their own sovereignty, but they have agreed to share considerable amounts of their sovereignty in the European Union. And that creates a bit of legislative complexity. That's an important part of the story that I'm going to talk about, but I'll explain it as we go along. So here is a very brief recap of what the European Union is like. And if you already know that, I apologize, but if you don't know it, well, here's a bit of a refresher. So as I said, the European Union is somewhere between a superstate and a bunch of individual nations. And the way it works is that we have 3 institutions, as we call them, at the European level that together make EU laws. We have something called the European Parliament, which is directly elected by the people of Europe. It's basically a normal type of parliament, except that it's on top of the national parliaments. We have something called the Council, which is basically the heads of state, the governments of the member states. So 27 member states, their governments are represented in the Council. And then we have something called the European Commission, which is not quite a government. It's more like a civil service, but a very powerful civil service, because it has the only right to propose new laws. So the European Parliament cannot propose new laws, the member states cannot propose new laws. It's only the European Commission which can propose new laws, and the Commission consists essentially again of people appointed by the member states. Well, how does it work? We have basically 2 kinds of laws. We go through directives, which is a law that is not directly applicable, but each of the 27 member states then has to translate that into their national law so that it becomes effective. And some things we call regulations, which are directly applicable. So the European Union can issue laws that are directly applicable, and then we have the possibility that the European Commission can issue implementing acts for very specific technical bits. And of course, as we talk about sustainability reporting, we are talking partly about very technical stuff that is implemented by direct implementing measures from the Commission. So the fact that there are three institutions involved in this is something that I'll come back to later on. And that we have these two flavors, directives that go through member states and regulations that are directly applicable. So once we know that, we can talk about the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and we'll talk first about what the original idea was, the ambitious plan that I talked about. So here, in this slide, you see very briefly how the European Union has regulated corporate reporting until quite recently. We have something which is called the Accounting Directive, and a directive, as you remember, is something that's not directly applicable. All the member states have to implement it in their national laws, but it has happened. And that includes basic requirements for corporate reporting by listed and unlisted companies. It touches about 13.5 million companies, so not just the listed entities, who have to prepare their financial statements and their annual reports on that basis. And there are graded requirements. There are extensive requirements for what we call large entities above a certain size threshold, and then you get more easy, simplified requirements for what we call medium-sized and micro or small entities, which is obviously the bulk of them. But we still have about 43,000 large entities which have to comply with all the complete reporting requirements. A subset of those, the listed companies, 7,500 companies, have to comply with IFRS in their consolidated financial statements, and we did that by having a regulation directly applicable that says all listed companies in the EU use IFRS on a consolidated basis. Not directly, we have a kind of improvement and endorsement mechanism. So if the IFRS changes a regulation, then an advisory body called EFRAG issues an advice on whether it's a good idea or not to implement that. And if that advice is accepted, then the European Commission will issue a regulation that says, now you have to apply this IFRS standard. That is the regulatory mechanism that we have in place for corporate reporting. And that's in the upper right corner, you see some additional requirements, but we don't need to talk about them. And the reason I talk about that is because we have tried to add sustainability reporting requirements to this regulatory framework. So what we did in 2014, about already 10 years ago, there was something called the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, again, something that had to be implemented in national member states. And that set essentially very simple requirements for sustainability reporting, a so-called non-financial statement by listed entities, essentially, and some larger public interest entities. It didn't have a lot of details. What it basically said is that all these companies, all these listed entities had to provide non-financial statement based on some existing framework. And it could be GRI or SASB standards or the IRC integrated reporting framework. You could choose as a company whatever you wanted, as long as you did something on the basis of an agreed framework. So a relatively light touch regulation. But it did mean that all these listed companies at least had to make a start with what you might call sustainability reporting from 2017 onwards, when this came into effect. So most listed companies in the European Union have had at least a few years experience of dealing with standards like GRI standards, for instance. Then a few years later, in 2019, the European Commission came up with something called the European Green Deal, which was a very, very ambitious package of legislation, new legislation, improved existing legislation, to make sure that the whole European Union, in many respects, would become a lot more sustainable. So it was regulation or proposals for regulations in all kinds of areas, ranging from agriculture to circular economy to energy, to social minima, whatever, an enormous package of regulation. And somewhere hidden in there was a small part that says, oh yeah, we also need to upgrade our financial reporting requirements. in order to support this Green Deal. But all of this happened just a few years, if you remember, after the Paris agreements, in a political climate in which not just in Europe, but in many countries and economies around the world, people were were becoming interested in sustainability, in climate change. There was a kind of a political groundswell in support of making a major push towards becoming more sustainable. And all of this was, as I said, very ambitious, with very tight deadlines, and that included the financial or the corporate reporting bit. So the proposal was to move out this non-financial reporting directive, replace it by something called the Corporate Social Responsibility Directive, which was enacted in 2022 after relatively short deliberations. And that Corporate Social Responsibility Directive, which therefore had to be implemented in the member states, this wasn't applicable directly, had very ambitious timelines because it envisaged that already in 2024, the large listed companies would have to start reporting on this basis. And it also did something else. It said, we're going to develop in Europe our own European sustainability reporting standards, which therefore had to be ready by 2024. They simply didn't exist in 2022. So in just a few years, the European Union committed itself to developing a complete package of sustainability reporting standards ready for implementation in 2024. And after that, there was a phased transition plan from 2025 to 2028, when gradually all the listed companies, all the large unlisted companies, and the subsidiaries of foreign entities would also have to comply with this framework. And the plan was that these ESRSs would be developed by the existing advisory body called EFRAG, which therefore became a real standard setter, and would be implemented in regulations endorsed by the European Commission. So that was the plan. And as you may or may not know, there was also something else called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which was not a reporting directive, but a real requirement for action. But we'll not talk about that. But it was part of a broader package of legislation to ensure that companies actually did take responsibility for climate change, for pollution, for human rights, and so on. But the CSRD is a pure reporting framework, so the CSRD doesn't commit you to anything, any specific action. So the only thing it does ask is that companies report about what actions or no actions, or what plans or no plans that they have. So these ESRSs had to be developed at very, very great speed by EFRAG, and this was the plan that they had, the idea. There would be a few so-called cross-cutting standards, E1 and E2, which would set out the main generic requirements of sustainability reporting, and then a block of about a dozen topical standards dealing with recognizable issues like climate change and workers and biodiversity and business conduct. And then a subsequent plan for developing sector-specific standards for extractive industries and for transports, and you name it, with more detailed and sector-specific requirements, and a standard for SMEs. So that ensure that there was a complete package, both detailed as required or less detailed as required, given the size of companies, for reporting on sustainability standards. Well, as I said, all of this was developed under a rather high time pressure. Some people have really literally had to forgo a lot of sleep about it, because there were, in a very high speed, a number of working groups were created that developed standards and that had to get input and so on. So it was has been a very dynamic couple of years, I can tell you. I'm a member of the Dutch Accounting Standards Board, who had to comment on all of this, and it has really been amazing to see how fast this package has been actually developed. If you remember that the IASB, for instance, has done, let's say, 20 years about developing standards for insurance contracts, just to develop a complete package of sustainability reporting standards in a couple of years, that's not nothing. But they did it, so we have it. We have this set of ESRSs and the CSRD, and here are some of the few outline points. So what are the key features? The core of the whole package is that each company has to identify material sustainability, so-called impacts, risks, and opportunities, IROs. So as a company, you have to think for yourself about what, for our company, are the key impacts that we have, the key risks that we see, the key opportunities we have for all sustainability reporting matters. That's really the core of the whole standard. I'll talk a bit later about that more as we go along. And another key feature is that you have to assess it on the basis of double materiality, which, as you probably know, means that you just have to consider both the impact of sustainability on your company's financings, your present and your future cash flows, but also the impact of your company's operations on the environment, on the climate, on affected communities, on workers, and so on. So it's both what we call outside in and inside out, a double perspective on sustainability. And you have to consider the whole value chain, so not just your own workers, but your workers in the value chain, not just your own carbon emissions, but also upstream and downstream. And you have to report on each IRO that you identified using the generic framework. What's your governance model, what's your strategy, your business models, your policies, your actions, your metrics, and your targets. And that probably looks familiar to you because a lot of this, of course, has been derived from existing frameworks such as the GRI, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So it's not as if everything had to be developed from scratch. So in a way, was possible to develop this in a few years, but still a lot of work had to be done to bring all of it together, especially because not all of the existing frameworks do have a double materiality framework. So that's the big picture of what the CSRD and what the ESRS require. As I already said, all of this has been developed at a huge speed. And there has, of course, during the process, many people have said, well, is this really possible? Can we really develop a good, a robust set of standards if you just rush it through, if you just give people a few weeks, maybe a month to respond to a very voluminous set of exposure drafts? Has it been field tested? Has there been proper consultation? Well, the answer is, well, there has been some of that. But clearly not with the level of attention and detail that you would normally expect. There have been other concerns. Well, obviously, it was right and proper that many NGOs were consulted in the process, that they were part of the working groups, that they had the ability to give an impact. Nobody had anything to say against that. That's all very right and proper. But there have been concerns that their voice has been perhaps a bit too large, too loud, that has drowned out a bit too much of the other voices. And to put it bluntly, there has been criticism that these ESRSs are, up to a point, just a simple wish list or a shopping list of NGOs that could simply list whatever they wanted to hear, and it would all end up in the ESRSs. That's not quite how it happened. That's an easy criticism. But clearly there has been some concern about, well, have the balance, has to have the interest of the preparers and the users of the organization been properly balanced. I mean, criticism of drafting quality. If you rush things out, it's inevitable that things are not clear, that there are contradictions and all of that. And there's a question there?
No, sir. No, sir.
Okay.
I think,
well,
yes,
never mind. If there is a question, just let me know, but otherwise I'll just continue. Okay, and another very obvious discussion point has come up is, should Europe really try to develop its own standards here? We have adopted IFRS standards, global standards for corporate reporting. Shouldn't we do the same thing for sustainability standards? Shouldn't we join some global effort like the International Sustainability Standards Board? So many people in Europe would think that would have been a very good idea. But then other people said, well, yeah, we don't want to give up our own sovereignty for financial reporting. Perhaps that's okay, but sustainability reporting is more political. The world as a whole doesn't share all the same views about sustainability and corporate responsibility. So we should really push ahead on by ourselves. And then, of course, the cost-benefit issues. So, as I said, the plan was to extend these requirements to a very large group of companies. So the large listed companies had already, as I said, been used to working with GRI and so on. But many of the large unlisted companies have basically zero experience with all of this. And to expect them to adopt from scratch a very ambitious package of standards that is, well, risky. And all of that, or much of that, came together in what I call the data point scare. So as this developed, people started talking about, well, all these ESRSs, they require over 1,000 data points of companies. You have to report on 1,000 or more things. Well, that wasn't quite true, because if you add up all the requirements of the ESRSs, you would find that many of them are optional and some of them are only applicable in very specific situations. But even so, it was true that the ESRSs were a very major step forward. It didn't really help in a way that EFRAG tried to be helpful by issuing even more implementation guidance, which just reinforced just how complex all of this was. So they issued large Excel sheets listing all of these data points, and you see just one example here. You probably can't read all the small print, but it doesn't matter. It just gives you an idea that companies that looked at this would say, oh, wow, do we really have to gather all these data, and can we do that? And producing these spreadsheets makes it very easy for people to criticize, well, this is just over the top. Companies can't produce all these data at cost. Whether that was all fair or not is something we can talk about later, but this was the kind of discussion that happened. So, with the background, we went to 2024, when the first wave of companies, the large listed companies, a little under 1,000 companies, the biggest ones, had to adopt these standards, and they have done so. So we have gone through a first year of implementation of these reports, and I want to talk about that now. What have we seen? What does it look like in practice? I want to draw your attention to two useful tools, or at least that may be useful if you want to know more about what's happening here about sustainability reporting in Europe. And one of them is what is known as the Sustainability Reporting Navigator, and you'll find a link in the slides that have been sent around. And that's a tool set up by a couple of German academics with some subsidies from the German government, which basically gives you a complete, or more or less complete, set of financial reports or corporate reports as they have been published on the CSRD. So it's a database with all the reports, and some tools for analyzing and summarizing them. It's not pretty limited. If you want to do real analysis, you still have to download these corporate reports and do the analysis yourselves. But the report does have some simple benchmarking, which allows you to get a quick overview of some major features of all of these reports. So, for instance, in this slide, you see a simple example. You choose a company, Airbus, and you can show how let's say, the number of words that they devote to climate change or diversity or biodiversity, whatever, compares to country peers, all companies, industry peers, whatever you have. So this tool does allow you to get a quick overview of what's been going on, and it hopes to develop. So it hopes to develop into a library of interesting studies on these data, and it gives summary updates on the regulatory process. So yeah, it's a good tool that you can use if you want it. Another comparable tool has been developed by EFRAG called ESRS Reporting Insights, which also has basically the same database of corporate reports, sustainability reports published under the CSRD, and some dashboards. They're still limited, but I guess they will develop them further on as we go along. But they do again allow you to make selections of companies or countries and get some basic descriptives on what's been going on. So in this slide, for instance, you see how many companies actually report biodiversity metrics. And you'll see that there's quite a difference across countries, in this case, in the columns, and across the industries. So in the construction industry in France, everybody is reporting about biodiversity metrics, but in the transportation industry in Germany, 0% are reporting biodiversity metrics. So you can see that we still have quite a way to go in making all of this comprehensive and comparable, but at least we can see roughly what's been going on in this first year of implementation. And by the way, nobody expected that the first year of implementation would be perfect. So all the national regulators have expressed the view that, of course, we want to see that companies make a serious effort in moving in this direction, but nobody expects all companies to have everything in order in year one. Because it has been perfectly clear that even for companies that have been, let's say, working with GRI standards for 10 years or so, it still was a very, very significant effort to make the move to the rather more demanding ESRSs. So what I'm going to do, I've just taken one company, more or less random, which is called Ahold Delhaize, which is a supermarket chain from the Netherlands and Belgium. And I chose it just to give a few examples of what this type of reporting looked like. It does have an Indonesian link. It has a joint venture with Super Indo. So if you go there, that you're doing shopping with Ahold Delhaize, but that's the company I'm talking about. And I'll talk about a few selected topics, both on the basis of this company's reporting and on the basis of the EFRAG database and the SRN Navigator database that I talked about, and a few other studies that I've come across, and some of the things I've observed myself when reading these statements. So I'm not going to give you a full, let's say, scientific survey of everything that's in there. It is huge, so people are still trying to come to grips with what's in there. I'll give you just sort of a first impression of what you can see and what you can find and some of the issues and topics that we are talking about. So what you see for this company, Ahold Delhaize, is that its sustainability statements are about, we'll start on page 84, then go on to about page 180, so about 100 pages with some appendices. It is roughly the average that EFRAG noted across companies, so about 110 pages of sustainability statements based on CSRD. So that's quite significant in terms of information content. It's actually difficult to navigate. It's a huge amount of text and tables or words. So what all companies do is give appendixes which allow people to quickly spot where to find which particular bit of information. So if you want to know what this company has reported on the basis of standard E1, say, which is the climate change standard, you can find the page references to the specific policies and metrics and whatever that they report. Because there is a kind of overall structure in ESRS, and companies are expected to report things in more or less the same order, but it's still a bit of a struggle to locate and identify the specific information. In the future, this should be easier when all of this is being tagged in XBRL, but we can't do everything at once. So the XBRL tagging of all this information is work in progress, but it will become mandatory only 1 or 2 years down the road. So at the moment, what you have is basically PDF documents in which you have to locate the information, either doing textual searches or using this kind of indices. And it's a lot of information. So as I said, the key part, the heart of the whole exercise is the identification of IROs, impacts, risks, and opportunities. And many people, including myself, are very curious to see how companies would do that, because this is the most company-specific, most judgmental part of the whole story. You cannot simply say that every company has to do the same. No, it's all individual, it's all company specific. So it's very interesting to see how companies do that and how they report it. And for instance, how many IROs they identify. So Ahold Delhaize has identified 16 major IROs divided in 55 subtopics. But if you look across companies, in a sample of Dutch companies that a couple of others have done, you see a range of something like between 1 and 74 IROs. In European samples that I have seen, we have come up to, let's say, 70 or more IROs, but also very low, 2, 3. So you still see that there's a huge diversity among companies that is not just explained by their industry and their business activities, but also by simply trying to figure out when is something material enough to report. And if you have identified 16 major topics or 55 subtopics, then the question is, how are you going to make this readable, understandable for the readers of your corporate reporting? So companies have been trying, like Ahold Delhaize, have been experimenting with tables like this, which give summaries of all the IROs and give little graphical indications of how important they are, whether they're on the short or the medium or the long term, and whether they're positive or negative and high risk, low risk. Companies are struggling to develop reporting frameworks, formats to help people navigate this type of information. And personally, I think that the way ALDE does it is quite a nice way of at least giving a high level overview. What are the main issues? How significant, how risky are they? Before going on down into the details. So if you look at the EFRAG database, you see here, for instance, a slide that shows you across the major standards, so from E1, the climate change, to G1, the governance standards, how many companies in different industries have actually reported that topic as a material, one or more material IROs. And it's obvious that climate change is identified as material by just about everybody. That's partly a feature of ESRS, so there's a very high threshold in ESRS to claim that climate change for you is not relevant. So basically, the standard assumption is that climate change is relevant for everybody. And it's also pretty obvious that own workforce is also relevant for just about everybody. As long as you have a few employees, then own workforce is obviously relevant. So that's a no-brainer. Governance is also relevant. All companies have governance. All companies have to say something about it, so that's clear enough. But then from that point onward, you get the diversity. So for instance, biodiversity is quite mixed, with some companies reporting very low materiality and other companies quite high. Circular economy obviously develops on how material intensive you are. Affected communities is a difficult one. It's a standard that's still controversial in a way. How do you identify them? And it's also, again, very dependent on the industry you are in. But clearly what you can see here is that is very much work in progress. It is not likely at all that these percentages that you see here are the definitive percentages. Companies are trying to find a way around to what is normal. And what we expect to see over the next couple of years is that we, of course, see a kind of convergence. We have this range now from 1 or 2 IROs to 70 or more. And the expectation, of course, is that it will kind of converge when companies look at what their peers are doing, what other industries are doing. So the expectation is that over time, we'll see a much more homogeneous picture of across countries and industries of what kind of IROs are being identified. And one very clear issue that wasn't really apparent upfront, but it has become very apparent during this first year of implementation, is the question whether these IROs should be identified on a gross or a net basis. That's not clear at all in the ESRSs. And the issue is basically, does it matter whether a company has taken mitigating measures? So it may be the case that you are, let's say, a manufacturing company, and that your factories emit a lot of polluting gases. But if you have put filters on your chimneys and you basically capture all of that, is it then still an IRO or not? And does it count? Do you say, well, yes, potentially we are polluting, but we have taken very strict measures to limit our pollution, and therefore we basically don't pollute? Does it then mean that you don't have an IRO on this issue or not? That is a very controversial issue, and as you can see from this little graph, companies have interpreted these regulations quite differently. A minority has said, yes, we take a gross basis, so we report our risks even though we have mitigated measures. But most companies says, no, we don't do that. So if we think the risk has been managed, is relatively small because of our measures, then we don't recognize it as an IRO. And obviously, this has a very big impact on what you're then going to report subsequently. So this is one of these experience points, you might say, that at least in Europe has come up during implementations. I will not, of course, say that nobody has thought about it before. Of course, some people have mentioned it, but it has become a lot bigger during the first implementation year as people realize and think about what it actually means. Because then the question becomes, when is a mitigating measure sufficient enough to count? So if you say, well, I have a plan to improve, to install filters to capture my emission, does that count? No, most people say that doesn't count. What if you have installed your filters halfway during the year? Does that count? And most people say, no, that doesn't count. You get in that kind of discussion. That still takes further resolution. Okay, let's move on to some other selected issues, the greenhouse gas emissions. Well, that was in a way the easiest one because the ESRSs essentially refer to the greenhouse gas protocol, which is an established framework for dealing with these issues, although it's a framework that's still under development. So the greenhouse gas protocol is also a bit of a moving target. And there are issues there are still some unclarities and options in the greenhouse gas protocol that raise issues like, well, are these options then also available in ESRSs? But anyway, many companies had already been reporting on the basis of the greenhouse gas protocol, so this was a relatively easy starter. The main change was that ESRSs include mandatory Scope 3 emissions. So under the greenhouse gas protocol, strictly speaking, Scope 3 emissions are voluntary. The greenhouse gas emissions upstream or downstream in your value chain, but under the ESRSs, you have to report Scope 3. So some companies had to take that step from Scope 1 and 2 to Scope 3. And the upshot is, if you look at what companies report, you still see a considerable diversity. So some companies that have been doing this for a couple of years, maybe for 10 years or more, have already quite sophisticated approaches and methodologies, and other companies are only doing this for 1 or 2, 3 years, and they are still struggling to get up to speed. So if you look in detail at these standards, you will see quite a lot of companies that claim exceptions that say, yeah, we have done Scope 3, but only for, let's say, tier 1 suppliers and things like that, or only for Europe or whatever. All kinds of scope exceptions that you would not allow on the financial reporting, but it are allowed as a kind of transition approach to a full adoption. Another big story is the financial impact. So ESRSs do require you to discuss and disclose the potential financial impact of climate change on your company, both in terms of physical risks. So what does climate change mean for your operation? And in terms of transition risk, what does climate transition mean for your business operations, for your financing, for whatever? So in principle, companies have to give information about what climate change means for their cash flows in the short, in the medium, and the long term. Under the transition requirements, that could still be relatively limited, but companies have been struggling with thinking about, well, what does this mean? How can we do that? You are not exactly required to give full financial forecasts for 10 years ahead. It would be impossible. But you have to give something, at least qualitatively. And how do you do that? How do you distinguish conceptually the impact of climate change on your business operations from any other changes that you expect in your business operations because of technological developments, because of AI, because of geopolitics, because of US tariffs, you mention it. So to give a good conceptually sound distinction between the financial impacts of climate change or other sustainability issues and your normal operations and your normal dynamic in your operations is quite difficult. So it's not surprising that this particular feature has been limited reported. I just pick another topic, moving from climate change to something completely different, the gender pay gap. So there are also standards on social issues, especially worker issues. So ESRS 1 calls for the so-called unadjusted global pay gap based on the average hourly wages of males versus female employees. And one example that you then find is Unilever, which a company you may know. It makes detergents and washing powder and ice cream and stuff like that. It also sells in Indonesia, I'm sure. And it reports a gender pay gap of 49, which means that in Unilever, females earn a lot more than males, which sounds great in terms of, let's say, equal opportunities and so on, and adjusting a gender balance. But it is essentially a bit of a nonsense number. Because it depends very much on where a company's operations are and how the gender balance differs from country to country. So Unilever has a lot of manufacturing operations in low-wage countries, and a lot of the operatives in those factories in low-wage companies happen to be men. And therefore, relatively speaking, a lot of females are working in positions not necessarily very high up in the hierarchy, but in other countries, but in positions that earn more than the wages that these low-wage male operators in other countries earn. So that's where you get this number from. But it's a very difficult to interpret number, and it compares not at all with numbers in other companies. So yeah, you have to report it. But most people say, well, yeah, of course you can do this, but does it really help? So many companies have added additional numbers on a voluntary basis. It also applies to Ahold Hazard that I talked about. They talk about adjusted pay gap numbers. And you can adjust in any way you want. You can say, okay, we'll limit it to Europe. We'll limit it to just certain employees above a certain function level, like a manager level, say. So at this point, of course, anything goes. You can come up with any number that you want. On the one hand, of course, it's a good thing that companies help readers to make sense of these unadjusted numbers, but the comparability, of course, is simply nowhere, because even though we may think that the numbers, the adjusted numbers that Ahold has or reports are useful for that companies, they are still very difficult to compare with those of other companies. So this is clearly an area where, yeah, more thinking needs to be done before we have something that you can actually put in a database and then use. Another thing that has come up in experience is that in the whole area of sustainability reporting, third-party standards and data are huge. So in financial reporting, it's simple. You have IFRS is basically the standards, and all the company owns all the data about the cash flows and the costs and the assets and liabilities, and that's basically what you can deal with to produce financial statements. But for financial reporting standards, both part of the standards and part of the data are somewhere else. So this is Ahold Delhaize, which is a simple example. They use something called the food waste protocol, which is not an ESRS, but which is like the greenhouse gas protocol, a kind of global industry initiative to develop more specific standards for defining what food waste actually is. So if you sell somebody an orange, is the orange peel then food waste or not? And if it is actually, if some food waste is then used for animal feed, does it still count as waste? Those kind of issues you need to think about before you can come up with decent measures of what waste is and what recycling of waste means, and so on and so on. That's at the level of detail that might perhaps have been included in the industry standards of ESRS, but they aren't there yet. It's certainly not at the level of detail at the generic ESRSs. So you do find that companies in many industries do reach out to these existing third-party standards. And the same is true for data. So when it comes to biodiversity, for instance, and the impact on companies, that's an area that companies really struggle with. What you need for biodiversity is information about locations. So biodiversity is very much a location-specific issue. So greenhouse gases are easy. Any ton of carbon dioxide that you pump into the air anywhere just ends up in the atmosphere generally, but biodiversity is very location-specific. So you need very detailed geodata on where the vulnerable areas are in terms of the biodiversity to see whether any of your activities is in or near such an area. And you need third-party data for that. So, for instance, the World Wide Fund for Nature has something called the Biodiversity Risk Filter, which is an external party database that helps companies to assess the risks of their data. And there is really an enormous range of this kind of databases and support tools and frameworks that companies use. And again, it's a good thing in a way because it helps them to make their reporting more serious, but it doesn't always help to make the reporting more comparable. And I can tell the same story about wages. So ESRS requires you to think about, do we pay our employees in all the countries in which we operate an adequate wage? But then the question is, what is an adequate wage? There is some definition in the ESRSs, but it's good enough for Europe because there's a kind of standardized legal framework in Europe about wages. But once you get outside of Europe, it becomes very difficult to formulate a robust standard criterion for what an adequate wage is. So again, companies go to private sector websites like wageindicator.org, which does generate calculate fair wages. But again, there's a diversity of sources. The International Labour Organization has its own criteria for defining adequate wages and so on. There's still quite a lot of diversity here. And it's clear that companies are really calling for more guidance on which third-party standards and data they are allowed or should be using to figure out, well, what things like adequate wages are. Well, all of these issues, of course, already existed before ESRS came along. You also had to deal with these things in GRI, but the level of requirements was a lot lower. So it was all on a voluntary basis, and the auditing was relatively light. So nobody really looked very hard. But now, when you really have to do this on a mandatory basis with an auditor looking in, then the real nitty-gritty of all these issues really comes home to companies that try to do this. So that's a quick overview of the first round of reports and what we've learned. There's much more we could say about it, but we have to limit this session to about an hour, I understand. So I want to wrap up by looking at where we stand. And I already said there has been a change of political climate on this issue. So what happened in 2024, while the first wave of companies were working very hard to report it, we had European elections and in the European Commission, and it was clear that Europe-wide politics is moving more from the left towards the right. It varies across member states, but the overall picture is clear enough. What also happened was that in 2024, Mario Draghi, which is a very prominent European politician, issued a report on European competitiveness, which really set alarm bells ringing. It was a very alarming report. It said Europe really has to take care of its competitiveness. We really risk losing business, losing industries, losing our economic strength if Europe doesn't take action to support its business, to make sure that regulation is up to date, and so on and so on. That was a very clear, important message. It has been heard well enough. And then, of course, we have what I call the other international developments. And I'm thinking, of course, in particular about the US elections and the arrival of the Trump administration, which has clearly changed the tone of the debate about everything related to sustainability and ESG, certainly in the United States, but also around the world. I'm not saying too much when I say there has been quite a strong backlash against everything having to do with sustainability and ESG and all of that. So against that background, again, at the end of 2024, the European Commission chairperson, von der Leyen, the lady with the orange jacket pictured in the diagram, the chairperson of the European Commission, announced a revision of the CSRD and related legislation. Now, mind you, as we were just implementing it. As the train was moving, people were already saying, we need to change it. We're going to change it. And in February 2025, something which we call in European technical language, it isn't important why it is something called the omnibus proposals for a change of the CSRD and related legislation. And I've put up a picture of the emergency brake, and that is really how it felt like. We were at a very high speed for a couple of years. We've been moving towards this thing, and everybody's been working really hard to get it going. We were really working to implement it, and it really felt as if all of a sudden somebody pulled the brake and everything changed. And I put up a German picture of an emergency brake because, especially from Germany, the call for taking action was very, very strong. So the major German companies, the car makers and all of that, they were really very vocal in getting to the politicians saying, we really need change. This really has to be modified very, very significantly. And politicians then listen. If they are really getting scared about job losses, about business moving elsewhere, they really start paying attention. So the proposals, as they were issued, were most importantly a scope reduction. So the scope of the CSRD is going to be reduced to very large companies, both listed and unlisted, but very large in terms of turnover and employees. So a relatively small subsection of the original plan. So the original plan was that something like up to 40,000 companies would be affected by the CSRD, 40, and that's probably going to restrict it to well, maybe 2,500 companies. So major reductions. The sector standards have been built. There will be no sector standards. The assurance will remain at limited level. So there was a plan to move over time to reasonable assurance. So the same level of assurance that you get for financial statement, that has been scrapped for the time being. And has been postponed for the second waves of implementation has been proposed. And a simplification of ESRSs was announced. That was early 2025. So where do we stand now? So the next waves have been paused. So for next year, or for this year, I should say, for 2025, only the same companies that have been reported in a reporting over 2024 are going to report again with the same transition relief that they already had earlier. So their requirements were going to be phased in, and that's been postponed. There is still debate. So yesterday we had a vote in the European Parliament about what is going to happen. So by now so the big picture is pretty clear, but we still need a month or two of negotiation between the European Commission and the Parliament and the member state to arrive at the final cutoff points. So will it be companies with 5,000 employees or more, or 4,000 employees or more, or 4.5? I mean, that kind of negotiation.
No. Hah?
That's a question?
Kemana?
No, it's not a question, I guess. Okay.
No, Hassan.
Okay.
Ya,
Maybe then somebody should mute themselves. Okay. And all of this is extremely unfortunate because some of the member states have still not implemented this. In my country, in the Netherlands, the law that implements the CSRD is still in Parliament. It's stuck there. And we have elections this year, it doesn't help. So companies are in a kind of a legal vacuum. So the first wave of companies has reported over 2024 in the Netherlands on the basis of the CSRD, but strictly speaking, it was a voluntary reporting. But they did it because there was a risk that the government would say, we're going to implement it retrospectively. So you better do it before have a problem next year. And still, for the next year, for this year, 2025, we are still in this ambiguous legal position, not just in my country, but also in other countries, that companies will report, but what exactly the legal position isn't clear. Well, meanwhile, EFRAG has been working round the clock, really basically almost literally day and night, well, not quite, but almost like that, to simplify this package of reporting standards. Exposure draft was a preliminary draft was issued in July, an exposure draft with a short comment period, and they expect to submit the final package in about 2 weeks or so to the European Commission. The official publication is now planned for December, and then we'll see what we really end up with. But there has really been a lot of scrapping. This is just a simple example to give you a flavor of what's going on. The left column is the current text of the ESRSs. And then the middle column is all the stuff that has been removed. So with a red pen, they've been going through the ESRS and striking out a lot of requirements and simplifying them. And because of that data point scare that I mentioned, the European Commission has been very strong in its political message in saying, well, we're going to reduce the data points by at least 25% or more. So what EFRAG has been doing is cutting out data points, all the voluntary data points, many of the mandatory data points. So if you still now look at the spreadsheet, they have now about half the size of what they were before. And the total length in word count has been reduced by about 55%. So really a major change. So just imagine you're a standard setter, you've been working really hard for 3 or 4 years to develop a package of standards that's very big. And then in about half a year, you cut out 55% of that again. Just imagine the ISB doing that. It's amazing. I've never seen something like it before. So everybody is trying to see what's going to happen in the final standards here. Okay, that's where we stand, and I'm running out of time, so it's time that I make my closing remarks. All of this is very much work in progress. So I've said it's a little bit too early for real conclusions, but we can make a couple of remarks. So start with the positive point. As I already said, perfection wasn't expected. There was a legal gray area. So many companies could have said, we're not going to do anything until the law is clear. But the overall picture that we get from what I've seen personally, what other people have seen, what is reported in the database, is that really many companies, most companies, have really made a significant, reasonable effort. Of course, if you are a lecturer like me and you can give grades. Some would get just a 6 minus on a scale of 10, and others would get a 9. Great. But still, overall, a very serious effort have been made. Many people have learned a lot. Many companies have learned a lot. The learning curve has been steep, but people have really been trying to climb it. That's a good point. A negative point is that, as I have already been suggesting, the European Union has clearly overestimated its capacity for leadership here. I mean, they have simply been too ambitious. They have wanted too much, too fast. They haven't been given people time to go along, to get on board. And if there is now a backlash, part of it, they have themselves to blame for wanting to go too fast and too far, in my opinion. And I think that standard setters like the IASB have learned over time that they have due process, they need due process for a good reason. Not that long ago, about 20 years ago, the IASB was also criticized for going too fast, too far, not getting people on board, and they have learned. They have slowed down, they have given people more opportunity to participate in the process, to do field testing, to get a better idea of cost and benefits, about feasibility. And that lesson has not been learned clearly in this particular process. So what we now see is that expectations have been scaled down. So until, a year ago, 1.5 year ago, there was still an expectation that we would really get this major shift. And let's say, for instance, the audit firms, for instance, have been hiring people on a massive scale because they thought they would get thousands and thousands of clients that would need their sustainability reports certified. And a lot of that market has simply disappeared overnight. So a lot of the unlisted companies that would have been in the scope of the CSRD have said, okay, we're simply going to pause anything that we did on sustainability. We're simply going to stop it, unless it becomes clear that at some point we'll have to do something again. So a lot of potential market for auditors has disappeared, and people have started to take a more sober assessment of what can really be done. So the thing is not on the table. The sustainability reporting is still on the agenda, but it's a much more modest, more humble, perhaps, ambition that's left. And how far that can go is still uncertain, because obviously there are still major geopolitical uncertainties, not just in Europe. We may still get further elections at the national level, at the European level, and who knows what's going to happen in the next couple of years. But clearly, the situation in the United States is concerning. Just a week or two ago, we saw, you may have seen it or not, it was clear that some of the state attorneys in the United States were warning US companies not to comply with the CSRD because it was illegal in the United States for companies to pay attention to ESG. Well, that's an extreme standpoint, but still it tells us something about the kind of world that we are living in. And it's certainly not far-fetched to think that over the next years or so, European companies with business in the United States will come under pressure if they want to comply with this kind of regulation. And alternatively, there will undoubtedly be pressure on the European Union to not to require American companies with activities in Europe to comply with these regulations. So it really remains to be seen how that plays out. That said, I don't see any support for scrapping all of this altogether. So I think there is a lot of momentum across companies, and a lot of companies really do want to move in this direction. They had already been doing this before the CSRD, so it's going to remain. And therefore, I think that even on a smaller scale, with a smaller number of companies, I think the experience that's being built up in Europe now with doing this for real, in a real regulated environment, is really going to help to also going to help the ISSB in developing a large database of experience and information of what really works in practice in terms of sustainability reporting. And therefore, I do think, even though you can, have your thoughts about how this could have been done better, and I think it could have been done better, I think it still is a very useful learning experience in moving all of us in Europe and in Indonesia to improve sustainability reporting. So that is about what I had planned to say. I took about an hour. I think that's okay. I hope that's okay. So I guess the point now is, apakah ada pertanyaan?
All right. Thank you very much for the very inspirative explanation for Professor Kees. So, any comment for the audience? All right. Miss Diana Nurindasari, I think you can just turn on your microphone and ask Professor directly. Time is yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Miss Alif Aliatul, and thank you so much for Professor Dr. Kees Camfferman for the insightful about the sustainability reporting. What I'm curious about is how we can actually measure the effectiveness of sustainability reporting in creating real environmental impact. Because for the example, in Indonesian, some companies receive high score for the sustainability reports, but in social media, there are frequent public concern about some companies being involved in environmental degradation or social issues, and with climate change becoming increasingly evident, such as like extreme weather patterns, and how we can really measure and ensure about that sustainability reporting truly reflect a company's real environmental performance. Thank you so much, Prof.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. I think there are a couple of things you can say about that. The first thing I would say about it is that reporting is a relatively small part of the picture, right? Reporting has a role to play, but it's a modest role. So if you want companies' behavior to change, there are much more powerful mechanisms. The most obvious one is regulation. So a regulation with proper enforcement about what activities companies can do, about environmental protection, about pollution. So that's obviously the most direct and most powerful tool that you can have. And another potentially powerful tool is pricing. So when it comes to climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, many countries, but at least in Europe, we have for the last 20 years or so, we have an emissions trading scheme, which has actually helped quite a bit, I think, to give companies an economic incentive to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And it also has created, of course, a kind of transparency, because if you want to have a mechanism like that, you need fairly reliable emissions data, so companies can not just report any kind of data they want into the emission trading scheme. So you need to set up a kind of plausibility structure around that to make sure that whatever goes into the trading scheme is fairly reliable. So those are the most powerful mechanisms. And then in the third place, we have transparency and reporting, but by themselves, they don't do anything at all. They need to be supplemented by people actually taking note of what's being reported and then taking actions, either as consumers by buying or not buying company stuff, or as investors by buying or not buying their shares or whatever. But reporting itself doesn't do anything, of course. It requires people to act on that basis. That's not something you can easily do. What you therefore need is societies with the right attitude. You need investors with the right attitude and incentives. And of course, regulation can play a role there as well. So of course, you can have regulation that requires, let's say, pension funds to take sustainability issues in account when investing pension funds. And then, of course, in turn, the pension funds will take care of the reporting. But that requires a whole structure of regulation and enforcement. So it's not easy. On the other hand, it's not impossible. It can work. I think we have seen in Europe that over the last 5 years that you can build this sort of system of regulations and institutions and attitudes and media attention that does help to get this going in a reasonably serious way. It's not perfect. If you look in detail at a lot of the reporting that we've seen, yeah, there is obviously bits of greenwashing. Some companies do report more openly and honestly and transparently than others. That's inevitable. There is no simple mechanism where you can, with a snap of the finger, change it. But the alternative of not doing anything at all isn't great either. So can it work? Well, I hope it can. Of course, as I said, you do need a political climate and a social climate that helps. So if let's well, I mean, I can say that in many different words, but to put it very mildly, what's happening in the United States doesn't help. That's clear enough. And we have to see whether what we have built up so far can stand up against that negative attitude. I don't know. And the same is true in Indonesia. So you need your civil society, you need your everybody, your legislation, your enforcement agencies. They all need to come on board and help. And it's not easy. And there will be difficult situations because it's obvious and unfortunate and inevitable that there will be people around in your country, in my country, that don't care anything at all about sustainability. They just want to get the money. And then that's a fact of life that you have to deal with.
Oh, all right.
Does it
Diana,
answer your question? I
any
mean, of course,
comment?
I wish I had a simple answer, a simple recipe for answering your question, but there isn't such a simple recipe, I'm afraid.
Okay, I think it's clear enough. Thank you very much. So for the second question for Cynthia, Ibu Cynthia Diba.
Okay, does my voice is clear?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So thank you very much for presenting to us regarding CSRD. So Professor Camfferman, to be honest, I'm really your friend from Indonesia. So I've been following your publication. So I really passionate in international accounting standards. So here it's really nice to know that you also now working on the sustainability accounting standard too. My question is that I think you also have mentioned regarding the CSRD, which using double materiality. My question is that may I know the story behind the decision of European Commission or IFRAC to use double materiality, which I think that double materiality means they choose between GRI and ISB, right? So I really was curious about the story behind that. I think
Yes.
you know about that. And then also, I have three questions here. So that's my first question. And then my second question is that how's actually the regulation regarding the assurance in the CSRD? Is there any such an obligation regarding the assurance? And also the last one, as actually I always love, I really admire insight. I really want to know from your insight, how much do you think the role of accounting standard can bring the impact toward the action for corporation to make a change towards sustainability? Yeah, that's all my question.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's always nice to hear that somebody actually reads what I write. Yeah, and I have been, of course, I still think of myself as a financial reporting person, so I don't claim to be a deep expert on sustainability, but clearly these developments have been going around, and they are very interesting, and I want to know at least in outline what's going on there and see also how it affects corporate reporting in general, because some of these things that are happening here filter back again in how we look at and think about financial reporting standards. So, of course, nobody knows everything about these things, but I don't claim full expertise in the sustainability area. So where did the double materiality idea come from? That's a good question. It has been around for a while. So already in this non-financial reporting directive of 2014 that I mentioned, there was already the idea of double materiality, not very fully developed, but the idea was already that companies had to explain both the impacts on their own corporations and their impacts elsewhere. And the reason behind it is, well, to be honest, I cannot pinpoint the exact point in time where it entered the European legislative debate. But clearly, one of the things you have to keep in mind is that corporate reporting regulation in the European Union is not primarily capital market oriented. So the whole story that I explained in terms of the accounting directives and so on applies to all companies based on their legal form, not on their listing status. So already for decades, since the 1960s, the idea of why the European Union should be involved in corporate reporting regulation was not primarily to help investors make investment decisions, but to create a single market for goods and services, and to make sure that companies across the European Union have the same kind of requirements in that respect. And if you think in that perspective, it's much more broader perspective. So corporate reporting has a wider, more, you might say, more societal role. So it informs basically everybody, all stakeholders in companies. That's kind of embedded in the European philosophy, if you might call it like that. It's a bit of a big word, but of corporate reporting regulation, that it is stakeholder oriented rather than shareholder oriented. And from that perspective, it is quite natural when you start thinking about sustainability reporting to bring in that double materiality perspective. So that's the main story, but I'm afraid I cannot answer the question which particular person at which particular point in time made sure that it actually ended up in that regulation. It's an interesting question, by the way, and I probably want to look into it at some point, or you can do that. But it's the sort of question that I like thinking about and researching, but I haven't got around to do that. The assurance thing is, yes, the original CSRD, I think I mentioned that, had an assurance requirement. So it's a legal requirement that the sustainability reporting has to submit to assurance. Initially, limited assurance, and with a kind of phased-in future move to reasonable assurance, but that's now been scrapped. So for the foreseeable future, the legal requirement will remain limited assurance. And the CSRD says that can be done by an, let's say, established auditing organization or by a separate sustainability reporting assurance provider. And the CSRD does contain a framework for how these sustainability assurance providers can be accredited at the national level. So basically, whatever national body is in charge of accrediting auditors for financial statements also can accredit people to accredit sustainability reporting statements. And actually, they had to do that. So let's say KPMG in the Netherlands had to get a separate accreditation for accrediting sustainability statements from the Dutch regulator. And they, of course, they got that. So that structure is in place, and for the foreseeable future, it will remain limited assurance. Although we have seen that some companies, on a voluntary basis, highlight particular sections in their sustainability statements where they get reasonable assurance. So, in particular, on the more specific bits like the greenhouse gas emissions, which is kind of standard practice by now, which is more easily auditable. You see that some companies have, on a voluntary basis, moved that up to reasonable, but not many. That was your second point, I think. And the third point, have I answered your question so far? Okay.
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, good.
Great.
Your third question was whether how accounting standards can play a role. I think they can play a very, very, very big role, because it is quite obvious that you cannot simply expect companies to all invent for themselves how they have to do this. So companies really need the help of a structure of standards and framework to do this. And then the big question is, of course, how detailed should it be? So these standards are, in one way, a big help to companies. On the other hand, they are a headache, because they also ask questions that you find difficult to answer as companies. So getting the balance right is very difficult, but it's very clear that companies really want guidance. So from many companies, I've heard it say, okay, yes, if we decide to move in a direction and we accept that we're going to do that, then please, please, please give us the kind of standards that we can actually work with. So for instance, when it comes to this double materiality assessment, which is very complex and very company specific, companies have really been struggling with it. EFRAG has been trying to give implementation guidance, but it doesn't really help. So what companies have been saying is, please give us something that looks a bit like the SASB standards, which actually do that, which simply list for particular industries what the typical sustainability topics are, so that we can go down that list and say, yeah, okay, we take that as a starting point. And if we have nothing better, we can think of nothing better, we'll simply report these sustainability topics. Companies would love to have something like that, because it really makes their reporting choices easier. Even companies that are really willing to do this want that kind of regulation. But what they don't want is a very complex regulation that requires them to make a huge effort to collect a data point that they basically know that nobody uses, like the unadjusted gender pay gap ratio. It's not very difficult to compile, but it does take an effort. But you know for sure that nobody's going to use it because it's basically useless, because it's not comparable. And that's what companies don't like. So it depends very much on what kind of regulation you can offer them. Good. Anything else?
All right. So is it any comment, Bu Cynthia?
No,
It's all
thank you
good?
very much. Thank you very
Okay, thank
much.
you very much, sir. And I think we have one more questions from the chat room from Munib Ibrahim. So what long-term challenge will companies face in the CSRD continues to evolve or change direction based on the political cycles?
Yeah. That is, as they used to call it, the $64,000 question, but now it should be the $64 billion question, I think. Yeah, the political future is simply uncertain. I mean, I can't make that any nicer than it is. It is a challenge. Companies have to navigate a very uncertain political landscape in Europe and worldwide. It's a bit of a minefield. Actually, I already mentioned that. That companies that do business in the United States really have to think very, very carefully about what they do in Europe in terms of sustainability or in other countries, in order not to get into difficulties with US regulations and requirements as they are being interpreted by the current administration. But it's not just the United States. I don't just want to blame the United States. There are other countries that are problematic in this respect. The challenges are in terms of, what part of it is in a way natural, right? So the whole point of the CSRD and of these requirements is to force companies to think about what business do we actually do, and what do we want to do, and where do we want to be active, and how do we want to do that. So if the geopolitical situation is, say, that some of our activities are taking place in countries that are moving away from democracy, that are not dealing properly with human rights, then we should ask ourselves the question, can we afford not to be there? How are we going to deal with that? So in a way, the challenges that you mentioned, they are there, but in a sense, that's the whole point of the exercise, the CSRD, to get companies to be a bit more transparent about how they deal with operating in a world that is problematic. So it would be very nice for everybody if the whole world was just a nice place, if everything was well organized, and the only thing you had to do as a company is buy cheap and sell dear and comply with laws and regulation, everything would be fine. If we lived in a world like that, we wouldn't have all these problems. But the problem is that we do live in a world with very imperfect regulations and imperfect governments and imperfect societies, and companies have to think about what position they take in such a world and what it means for their operations and the business decisions. So up to a point, it's business as usual. And the whole movement towards sustainability reporting is to get companies to help companies and to help societies in which companies organize to think about these issues and make up our minds on what we want to do with them.
All right. Any comment, Muni?
No, thank you. It was a very good answer. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. So I think we come to the end, sir, for our guest lecture today. So I would like to thank you very much for the presentations. It's very insightful, and also the discussion is also very, very insightful because the question is very good, and you have explained it very well in very details. And maybe some point that I can highlight is that Professor Kees already uh, tell us about the story, the history behind this in the Europe. So at at the first time they talk about the reporting, the financial reporting, then move to the non-financial, but then use the social responsibility, and then until now it's keeps developing, right, sir? It keeps developing, even though the ESRS is already simplified, but it's still develop how the best things or how the best standard they can use in the Europe, that kind of things. Okay, and if there is no more questions or comment from the audience, I hope the professor can have closing remarks for us.
Well,
Yes, sir.
well, it's been very enjoyable to talk to you and to see at least some of you, and I hope you found it useful. And I certainly do hope it's good to see that so many of you are interested in this topic, and I look forward to see more work on being published about what's going on in Indonesia in this area, or the more broader Southeast Asian area, about developments there, because I know, not in great detail, I know that things are happening there as well, and your regulators and your parliaments and your governments are also working on similar things, and I'll be very interested to see what comes out of all of that.
All right. Thank you very much, sir. And thank you very much for all the participants who joined this guest lecture today. So I hope that we can have a lot of benefits from this meeting. And thank you very much. Good afternoon and see you next time, everyone. Have a good day.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Thank you,
Bye.
sir.
Sure.
Thank you, sir.
My pleasure.
Thank you, sir. Have a good
Thank you
day.
very much.
Okay, well, I'm was happy to do it. I hope you found it useful.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Okay, goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.